Welcome to Alien Whisper, where sizzling hot alien women and emotional sci-fi alien stories await you. If you enjoy thrilling adventures between humans and extraterrestrial beings, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below the video. Now, let's dive into the story. Sergeant Lucius Cooper had always believed that nothing could rattle him anymore. But when a mysterious, violet-eyed officer steps into his worn-out control room with a mission he can't refuse, everything changes. A deadly duel with an alien champion awaits, and Lucius is thrust into a war he never signed up for, one that tests not only his skills, but his very survival. But with every battle, his past and a forbidden connection with a woman from his academy days come back to haunt him. The question isn't whether he can win, it's whether he can live long enough to face the consequences. The control room of Outpost 7 smelled of stale coffee and burnt circuitry, a testament to years of neglect and budget cuts. Through the scratched observation window, Sergeant Lucius Cooper watches recruits stumble out of their simulator pods, faces slick with sweat and frustration. The holographic display flickered, spitting static as it rendered the jagged terrain of the Centauri ravine scenario. Lucius leaned over the control panel, his calloused fingers dancing across worn buttons. "Reset the simulation," he barked, voice rough but steady. "You're not done until I say you are." Private Wells, a lanky kid with earnest eyes, groaned from his pod. "3 hours, Sarge. My brain's fried." The others nodded, their fatigue palpable in the dim light. Lucius ignored the complaint, his gaze fixed on the display. "You think the enemy cares if you're tired? Centauri's not about surviving. It's about thinking when everything's against you." He tapped the command, and the virtual canyon reformed, jagged rocks casting shadows over the recruits' mechs. 5 minutes in, Wells made the same mistake. "Again. Wells, your left flank's wide open," Lucius snapped. "Use the terrain, not the manual. The standard play is what they expect." Too late. A simulated plasma bolt slammed into Wells' mech, and the pod screen flashed red. "Dead," Lucius said, not unkindly. "Anyone want to tell me what he did wrong?" Silence. The recruits were too focused, or too rattled, to answer. Lucius sighed. He followed protocol. "That's the problem. The enemy knows your playbook." Only Mina, a sharp-eyed recruit, held her own, crouching her mech behind a rocky outcrop. "Good, Mina," Lucius said. "Now, what's your exit?" Her voice crackled through the comm. "Both passes are covered, Sarge." Lucius allowed a rare smile. "Then make one." Mina hesitated, then fired at the canyon wall, triggering an avalanche that buried the enemy. Not enough to win, but enough to escape. "That," Lucius said as the pods hissed open, "is why we drill. The manual's a starting point. Victory's about rewriting it." The training room's doors slid open with a groan, cutting Lucius off. A tall woman in a pristine Earth Defense Force uniform strode in, flanked by 2 aides. Commander Juarez insignia gleamed on her collar, her eyes scanning the shabby facility with barely concealed disdain. Behind her stood Captain Elena Vasquez, her dark hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. Lucius's stomach tightened. He hadn't seen Elena in years, not since the academy, not since the day he'd thrown everything away. "Commander Juarez," Lucius said, straightening instinctively. "Didn't know we were due for an inspection." Juarez's voice was crisp. "We're not. Dismiss your class, Sergeant. We need to talk." Her tone carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. Lucius glanced at Elena, but her eyes were fixed on the floor. "Class dismissed," he announced. "Review today's data. I want better tomorrow." As the recruits filed out, Wells lingered. "Everything okay, Sarge?" Lucius forced a grin. "Peachy kid. Just brass doing brass things." Wells nodded, but his eyes flicked to Juarez, then back to Lucius. "My brother's out on Epsilon 4. Whatever this is, it matters, right?" Lucius's grin faded. "Yeah, Wells. It matters. Get some rest." Once alone, Juarez wasted no time. The Tal Sherry Dominion has challenged Earth to a duel. 1 champion, 3 rounds, different environments. They call it a cultural exchange, but it's a power play before trade talks for the Epsilon belt. Lucius snorted. A galactic pissing contest. What's it got to do with me? Juarez's gaze was unrelenting. Our top pilot, Major Ellington, is down. Poisoned, we suspect. The backup's too far out, and the third's in surgery. You're our only option. Lucius laughed, the sound brittle. Me? I'm a washout, Commander. I haven't touched a real mech in years. Juarez slid a tablet across the dented table. Your sim scores say otherwise. Unconventional, but effective. You hold 17 of the top 20 records here. Lucius scanned the data. Memories of late night sim runs flooding back. Not for glory, but because it was all he had left after the academy. His mind drifted to that day, 5 years ago. The academy's sim chamber, the air thick with tension. Lucius and Elena, paired for a high-stakes test. A virtual ambush had pinned their squad. Elena's mech caught in a collapsing structure. Protocol demanded retreat, but Lucius had disobeyed, diving into the wreckage to pull her out. He'd saved her, but the sim registered a squad wipe. The evaluators called it catastrophic risk assessment. Elena passed. Lucius was cut. As he'd left the chamber, her hand had grazed his, a silent thank you. He hadn't seen her since, until now. Elena stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. You're not a washout, Lucius. You never were. The Talsheri expect a show, but you can give them more. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the years melted away. Lucius shook his head, pushing the memory down. You're desperate, he said to Juarez. Desperate enough to bet on a junkyard dog? Juarez's smile was thin. Yes. You leave at 0600. Captain Vasquez will brief you. As they left, Lucius stood alone, the hum of the simulators fading. He touched the control panel, its worn surface grounding him. The Talsheri wanted a spectacle. Earth expected a dignified defeat. But Lucius Cooper had never been good at meeting expectations. If this was a shot, he'd make it count, for Wells's brother, for Elena's faith, for the part of him that still believed he could be more than a failure. The maintenance bay of Outpost 7 was a cavern of shadows, lit by flickering work lamps that cast jagged patterns across the walls. The air hummed with the whine of power tools and the faint crackle of welding torches. At the center, old Bessie loomed, a training mech so patched together it was more scar tissue than steel. Its hull bore the marks of countless repairs, weld lines crisscrossing like veins, paint chipped away to reveal raw metal. Lucius Cooper knelt beneath the mech's torso, a diagnostic tablet glowing in his hand, its screen flickering with error codes that made his jaw tighten. Wells, hand me the torque wrench, Lucius called, not looking up. Private Wells scrambled over, his boots clanging on the grated floor. This thing's a fossil, Sarge, he said, passing the tool. You sure it can handle a Talsheri war machine? Lucius grunted, tightening a bolt. Bessie's been through worse. She's stubborn like me. Wells chuckled, but his eyes darted to the mech's exposed wiring, doubt etched into his young face. Mina joined them, her sleeves rolled up, a streak of grease smudging her cheek. Targeting systems still glitchy, she reported, tapping a tablet of her own. 3 different generations of tech, all fighting each other. It's a mess. Lucius nodded, unsurprised. That's the charm. 3 perspectives, 3 ways to outthink a standardized rig. We just need them to play nice. He slid out from under Bessie, wiping sweat from his brow. The bay was a hive of activity. 6 recruits volunteering their off hours to get the mech combat ready. For them, it wasn't just about Lucius. It was about Epsilon 4, about families like Wells's brother, caught in the crosshairs of galactic trade wars. Lucius's gaze drifted to a corner of the bay, where a faint hiss caught his ear. He approached a hydraulic line, its casing slick with a faint sheen. Mina, check this, he said, voice low. She crouched beside him, her eyes narrowing. That's not wear and tear, she whispered. Someone cut it. Clean, deliberate. Lucius's gut twisted. Sabotage, not a random malfunction, but a calculated move to cripple Bessie before it even left the ground. Who'd have access? He asked, keeping his voice steady. Mina hesitated. Anyone with bay clearance. Techs, officers could be internal. Wells overheard, his face paling. Internal? You mean one of ours? Lucius stood, his mind racing. Keep this quiet, he ordered. We fix it, we move on. No one needs to know we're onto them. He glanced at the recruits, their faces a mix of determination and unease. Someone wanted him to fail, wanted Earth to look weak. The question was why. The bay doors hissed open, and Captain Elena Vasquez stepped in, her EDF uniform crisp against the grime of the room. Her dark eyes scanned the chaos before settling on Lucius. Sergeant Cooper, she said, her tone formal but warm. Commander Juarez sent me to brief you. Lucius wiped his hands on a rag, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened. Briefing in a maintenance bay? Classy. Elena's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. You're not exactly a conference room guy. She handed him a tablet, its screen displaying Tal'Sheri combat specs. The Tal'Sheri champion Thal pilots Bleeding Haven, she said. Triple redundant targeting, phase shift armor, reaction times 300% faster than our best. They're not just advanced, they're arrogant about it. Lucius scrolled through the data, his mind already picking at vulnerabilities. Arrogance is a blind spot, he muttered. Anything else? Elena hesitated, then lowered her voice. Juarez didn't want this shared, but there's chatter about sabotage. Not just Ellington's poisoning. Something's off, Lucius. Be careful. Her warning hit like a cold wind. Sabotage on Bessie, poison for Ellington. Someone was playing a deeper game. Thanks for the heads up, he said, meeting her gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. The memory of that academy sim hung between them. Her mech pinned his reckless rescue, the fallout that had cost him everything. You didn't have to stick your neck out for me, he said quietly. Elena's expression softened. You didn't have to save me back then. But you did. Her hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through him. Before he could respond, Wells called out, Sarge, hydraulics patched. What's next? Elena stepped back, the moment broken. I'll be Get to the transport by 0600, she said, voice firm. Don't be late. Lucius nodded, watching her go, the weight of her words lingering. He turned back to Bessie, his resolve hardening. If someone wanted him to fail, they'd have to try harder. That night, while the outpost slept, Lucius slipped through the shadows of the Tal'Sheri docking bay. The neutral station's architecture was a blend of organic curves and sharp angles, alien in its elegance. He wore a technician's jumpsuit, borrowed from a supply closet, his EDF insignia tucked away. The maintenance cradle holding Bleeding Haven came into view, its silver-blue surface shimmering like liquid starlight. Every line screamed precision. Actuators sleek, cooling vents discreet, armor adaptive. It was a predator built to dominate. Impressive, isn't it? A voice rumbled behind him. Lucius froze, turning slowly to face a towering figure. Thal, the Tal'Sheri champion, stood in formal military attire, his scaled skin glinting blue-green under the bay's lights. His slitted eyes assessed Lucius with cold curiosity. You're one of the human crew, he said, mistaking the jumpsuit for a technician's uniform. Here to spy? Lucius kept his expression neutral, seizing the opportunity. Just checking specs, sir. Making sure everything's up to code. Thal nodded, a gesture he'd learned for interspecies diplomacy. Bleeding Haven is our pinnacle, he said, pride evident. Targeting systems that never miss, armor that shifts to counter any attack. Your relic can't compare. He gestured to a monitor showing Bessie, her patchwork hull painfully outdated. Lucius circled the mech, noting actuator joints and thermal vents. Must be hell to maintain, he said casually. All that complexity. Thal's scales rippled, a sign of amusement. Our systems are harmony itself, unlike your chaotic approach. Lucius bit back a retort, filing away every detail. Harmony meant predictability. Predictability meant weakness. I've heard of your pilot, Ellington. Thal continued, his tone probing. Is he ready for me? Lucius kept his voice steady. Our guy's got tricks you won't see coming. Thal's eyes narrowed. I hope so. A weak opponent dishonors us both. Before Lucius could reply, a Tal'Sheri aide entered, summoning Thal to a diplomatic function. Perhaps I'll see you again, technician, Thal said, his voice edged with suspicion. From a distance. Alone again, Lucius exhaled, his mind racing. Thal's pride had betrayed key details, targeting redundancy, armor adaptability. Bleeding Haven was a masterpiece, but Lucius had spent years studying failure. Every system had a breaking point. He slipped back to the transport, the weight of sabotage and Thal's words pressing on him. Back at Outpost 7, Lucius found Elena waiting in the bay, her expression tense. "You went to their dock, didn't you?" she said, her voice a mix of worry and exasperation. Lucius shrugged, needed a look at the competition. She stepped closer, her breath visible in the cold air. "You're taking risks, Lucius." Like always. Her eyes searched his, and for a moment, the years fell away. "I can't lose you again," she whispered, her voice catching. Lucius's throat tightened. "You won't," he said, his hand hovering near hers. But the comm buzzed, Juarez's voice cutting through. "Cooper, status report." "Now." Elena pulled back, her mask of professionalism returning. "We'll talk later," she said, turning away. Lucius watched her go, the ache in his chest sharper than any sabotage. Bessie stood ready, her scars a mirror of his own. The Tal Sherry wanted a show. Someone wanted him to fail. But Lucius Cooper was no stranger to long odds. He'd make his own way, or die trying. The arena's lights pulsed like a dying star, casting stark shadows across the simulated cityscape below. Skyscrapers of steel and glass loomed overhead, their facades pocked with holographic scorch marks. Narrow alleys twisted between them, littered with debris, burnt-out vehicles, shattered concrete, the ghosts of a war that never was. Lucius Cooper sat in Bessie's cockpit, the neural interface helmet humming against his temples. The Mech's controls felt like an extension of his body, every creak and groan of its ancient frame a familiar ache. Through the scratched viewport, he saw the arena's vastness, a labyrinth designed to test not just skill but survival. "Pilot Cooper, this is Control." A voice crackled through the comm. "Commence entry when ready." Lucius took a deep breath, his fingers tightening on the joysticks. The neural interface buzzed, syncing his thoughts to Bessie's patchwork systems. "Let's dance, old girl," he muttered, guiding the Mech through the entry portal. Bessie moved with a lurching gait, her left leg actuator whining, a quirk no technician had ever fully fixed. Lucius had learned to lean into it, using the uneven rhythm to throw off opponents' aim. Across the arena, Bleeding Haven emerged, its silver-blue hull gleaming under the artificial lights. Thal's Mech was a predator, sleek and precise, every motion fluid as if it were alive. Its triple-redundant targeting systems locked onto Bessie almost instantly, a faint hum signaling their readiness. Lucius felt the weight of that gaze, mechanical and unyielding. He knew he couldn't match Thal's speed or firepower, but he didn't have to. This wasn't about winning, it was about making them sweat. Combat protocols engaged, the arena AI announced. "Round 1 commences in 3, 2, 1. A tone sounded, sharp and final, and Bleeding Haven surged forward, its thrusters flaring as it claimed a firing perch atop a low-rise building. Lucius anticipated the move. Talsheri doctrine favored early dominance. Instead of meeting it head-on, he sent Bessie diving into a narrow alley, her hull scraping against the walls, sparks showering like a flare in the dark. The noise was deliberate, a distraction to draw Thal's attention. Bleeding Haven's sensors pivoted, expecting Lucius to emerge from the alley's far end. But Lucius had other plans. He slammed Bessie's arm into a fire escape, using the Mech's raw strength to haul itself onto a rooftop. The structure groaned under the weight, concrete cracking, but it held. From this vantage, Lucius had a clear shot at Bleeding Haven's exposed sensor array, a rare blind spot in its sleek design. Bessie's targeting system, a jury-rigged mess of 3 mismatched generations, struggled to align. Lucius compensated manually, years of sim failures guiding his instincts. "Come on, girl," he whispered, firing a plasma burst. The shot grazed Bleeding Haven's array, not enough to disable, but enough to score a hit. A gasp rose from the observation gallery. Human and Tal'Sheri diplomats alike stunned. First contact advantage. Earth, the AI declared, its tone flat but electrifying. Kthal reacted instantly, Bleeding Haven pivoting with inhuman precision. A volley of laser bolts scorched the rooftop, forcing Lucius to roll Bessie behind a ventilation unit. The mech's armor sizzled, warning lights flashing across the cockpit. "He's pissed," Lucius muttered, a grin tugging at his lips. He knew he couldn't stay put. Kthal's targeting would lock on soon. Instead, he yanked a derelict hovercar from the rooftop's edge and hurled it toward Bleeding Haven, the wreckage tumbling through the air like a comet. The distraction bought seconds. Lucius sent Bessie leaping to a neighboring building, her actuators screaming. He didn't aim for cover, but for chaos, firing at a glass facade to rain shards onto Bleeding Haven's position. The Tal'Sheri mech danced through the debris, its phase shift armor shimmering as it deflected the worst. But Lucius wasn't done. He targeted a support beam in a nearby tower, collapsing part of the structure in a cloud of dust and rubble. The arena shook, the AI registering environmental damage as a valid tactic. For 10 minutes, it was a cat-and-mouse game. Lucius used every trick he'd learned from countless sim losses, vaulting over obstacles, baiting Kthal with exposed systems, turning the city itself into a weapon. He toppled billboards, ignited fuel tanks, created false heat signatures with burning debris. Bleeding Haven countered with relentless precision, its lasers carving through Lucius's improvised barriers. Kthal was adapting, learning Lucius's patterns, and the gap in technology began to tell. The end came swiftly. Lucius misjudged a leap, landing Bessie on a weakened platform. The structure buckled, and before he could recover, Bleeding Haven's primary cannon locked on. A single, perfectly aimed shot severed Bessie's mobility actuator, freezing the mech in place. Warning sirens blared, the neural interface burning with feedback. "Function impairment exceeds threshold," the AI announced. "Round 1 victory, Tal'Sheri." Lucius slumped in the cockpit, breathing hard as the neural interface disconnected. The sensation was like being ripped from a dream, his body suddenly small and confined. Despite the loss, a spark of satisfaction burned in his chest. Bessie had landed 3 scoring hits, 3 more than anyone expected. The round had lasted 20 minutes, twice as long as Juarez's grim predictions. He'd make Kthal work for it. In the maintenance bay, Lucius directed repairs, his hands deep in Bessie's wiring. The recruits swarmed around, their earlier doubts replaced by a quiet awe. "You hit him, Sarge," Wells said, passing a tool. "Nobody thought you could." Lucius grunted, focused on a scorched circuit. "I'm not done yet." A shadow fell across the bay. Lucius looked up to see Kthal, his scaled form imposing in the dim light. The Tal'Sheri champion's eyes glinted, assessing. "You fight well, for a human," Kthal said, his voice low but clear. "Your tactics are unorthodox." Lucius stood, wiping grease from his hands. "And you're not as invincible as you think," he replied, a half-smile tugging at his lips. Kthal's scales shifted, a flicker of something, respect perhaps. "We shall see," he said, turning to leave. "Prepare for the next round." As Kthal's footsteps faded, the bay doors hissed open again. Elena Vasquez stepped in, her EDF uniform slightly rumpled, her dark hair escaping its tight bun. Her eyes found Lucius, and the tension in her shoulders eased. "You did amazingly well," she said, crossing the room. "The diplomats are buzzing. You turned a sure loss into something inspiring." Lucius set down his tools, the weight of her words settling over him. "Inspiring's a stretch," he said, but his voice softened. "Just try not to embarrass us." Elena stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "You're doing more than that, Lucius. You always have." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them faded. The hum of the bay, the recruits' chatter, the looming threat of the next round. Her touch was warm, grounding, and he saw the depth of her feelings in her gaze, unguarded for the first time since the academy. "I thought I'd lost you back then," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. When they cut UI, she stopped, swallowing hard. Lucius's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that he'd made his choice to save her and would do it again. But before he could speak, the comm crackled. Captain Vasquez, Sergeant Cooper, report to command immediately. Juarez's voice barked, sharp and urgent. Elena pulled back, her professional mask slipping into place. We'll talk later, she said, her voice firm but laced with regret. Lucius nodded, watching her go, the ache in his chest sharper than the feedback from Bessie's interface. He turned back to the mech, its scars a mirror of his own. Kthal respected him now, a small victory. Elena believed in him, a heavier burden. But the fight wasn't over. If someone wanted Earth to fall, they'd have to get through him first. The arena had transformed into a void, a vast asteroid field suspended in a starless black. Chunks of rock, some the size of houses, others mere pebbles, drifted in lazy orbits, their surfaces glinting under the arena's artificial lights. Lucius Cooper sat strapped into Bessie's cockpit, the neural interface helmet buzzing faintly against his skull. The mech's controls vibrated under his hands, a familiar pulse despite the patchwork wiring and dented panels. Through the viewport, the zero-gravity environment stretched endlessly, a three-dimensional maze where up and down were meaningless. His stomach churned, not from nerves, but from the disorientation of a world without anchors. Pilot Cooper, this is Control, the comm crackled. Commence entry when ready. Lucius flexed his fingers, the neural interface syncing his thoughts to Bessie's thrusters. Here we go, old girl, he murmured, easing the mech into the arena. Bessie's maneuvering jets sputtered, her outdated systems struggling to adapt to the lack of gravity. The mech drifted slightly off course, her left leg actuator whining as always. Lucius compensated, using the quirk to spin Bessie in a slow, deceptive tumble, like a derelict ship lost to the void. Across the arena, Bleeding Haven entered with a grace that made Bessie look like a drunken brawler. Kthal's mech glided through the asteroid field, its silver-blue hull catching the light like a comet's tail. Its thrusters fired in precise bursts, positioning it behind a massive asteroid with clear firing lines. Lucius felt the weight of expectation. Talsheri technology was built for this, optimized for zero-G precision. Bessie, with her jury-rigged systems and uneven thrust, was a fish out of water. But Lucius had spent years in custom sims, training for the scenarios no one else bothered with. He wasn't here to play by Kthal's rules. Combat protocols engaged, the arena AI announced. Round 2 commences in 3, 2, 1. The tone rang out, and Bleeding Haven launched into action, its targeting systems locking onto Bessie's drifting form. Lucius let the mech spin, thrusters silent, playing the part of a malfunctioning relic. The Earth diplomats in the observation gallery winced, whispering about technical failures. Even Juarez's voice came through, tight with concern. Cooper, report status. Are you operational? Peachy, Lucius replied, his eyes fixed on the HUD. He waited until Bleeding Haven closed in, its cannons charging for an easy kill. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he fired Bessie's thrusters in a chaotic burst, sending the mech spiraling toward a cluster of smaller asteroids. The sudden shift threw off Kthal's aim, laser bolts slicing harmlessly through the void. Lucius grinned. Let's make this interesting. What followed was less a duel and more a guerrilla campaign in 3 dimensions. Lucius used Bessie's erratic thrusters to dart between asteroids, turning their drift into weapons. He kicked off a boulder, sending it tumbling toward Bleeding Haven while propelling Bessie in the opposite direction. The Talsheri mech dodged effortlessly, but the distraction gave Lucius time to reposition behind a larger rock. He fired a plasma burst, not at Kthal, but at a nearby asteroid, shattering it into a cloud of debris that fouled Bleeding Haven's sensors. Human, Thal's voice came through a private channel, against protocol, but clear as day. Your tactics are madness. His tone held a mix of irritation and curiosity. Lucius chuckled, guiding Bessie through a tight spin. Madness works when you're predictable, honored adversary. He emphasized the formal title with a mocking edge, knowing it'd get under Kthal's scales. The Tal'Sheri didn't respond, but Bleeding Haven's movements grew sharper, less measured. Lucius pushed harder, using the environment to his advantage. He slung Bessie around a massive asteroid, her hull scraping against its surface, leaving a trail of sparks. The maneuver was risky. Bessie's thrusters were overheating, but it put him above Bleeding Haven, a rare angle of attack. He fired, the shot clipping the Tal'Sheri mech's thermal dispersion array. The hit registered, and the gallery erupted in murmurs. Second contact advantage. Earth. The AI intoned, its voice cutting through the chaos. Kthal adapted quickly, his training kicking in. Bleeding Haven wove through the debris field, its phase shift armor absorbing stray impacts. Lucius knew he was running out of tricks. Bessie's systems were redlining, warning lights flashing across the cockpit. He needed a game-changer. Spotting a cluster of tightly packed asteroids, he had an idea. Reckless, but that was his specialty. He fired Bessie's grappling hook, an outdated feature most mechs had scrapped, and latched onto a boulder. With a full burn of the thrusters, he swung the rock like a wrecking ball, aiming it at Bleeding Haven's path. The move caught Kthal off guard. Bleeding Haven dodged, but the asteroid clipped its power core, registering critical damage. At the same moment, Bessie's overtaxed thrusters gave out, the mech spinning uncontrollably. Lucius fought the controls, but a stray debris fragment slammed into Bessie's mobility system, crippling it. The AI's voice cut through the din. Both units have sustained functional impairment exceeding threshold. Round 2 results, draw. Lucius sat back, his breath ragged, the neural interface's disconnection leaving him dizzy. A draw. No one, human or Tal'Sheri, had predicted this. The gallery buzzed with shock, diplomats scrambling to process the outcome. Lucius unstrapped himself, wincing as a sharp pain lanced through his shoulder. The interface feedback had been rougher than expected, leaving his muscles aching and his vision blurry. He climbed out of Bessie's cockpit, each step a battle against gravity's sudden return. In the maintenance bay, the EDF technicians were a whirlwind of activity, their usual grumbling replaced by a frenetic energy. Wells met him with a wide grin. A draw, Sarge? You're a legend. Lucius managed a tired smile, but his focus was on Bessie's battered frame. Legend's a stretch, kid. We're just getting started. He reached for a diagnostic tablet, but a wave of dizziness forced him to lean against the mech. Wells's grin faded. You okay? You look rough. Fine, Lucius lied, waving him off. Get the core stabilized. We got one more round. But the pain in his shoulder worsened, and a technician insisted he head to the med bay. Reluctantly, Lucius complied, the sterile halls of the Tal'Sheri station blurring as he walked. The med bay was stark, its walls lined with alien tech that hummed softly. A human medic scanned him, frowning. Minor neural strain, she said. You push the interface too hard. Rest for an hour, or it'll get worse. Lucius settled onto a cot, the cold surface grounding him. He closed his eyes, replaying the match. Kthal had been flawless, but Lucius had made him react, forced him out of his comfort zone. That draw wasn't luck. It was proof Bessie's junkyard soul could hold its own. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of boots. He opened his eyes to see Elena Vasquez standing at the door, her EDF uniform slightly askew, her dark hair framing a face tight with worry. You scare me out there, she said, crossing to his side. Her voice was soft, but edged with something raw. That swing with the asteroid? Reckless, even for you. Lucius chuckled, wincing as the movement tugged at his shoulder. Reckless is my brand. Got us a draw, didn't it? Elena didn't smile. She sat beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. You don't have to prove anything, Lucius. Not to me. Her words hit harder than the interface feedback. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the weight she carried. The years since the academy, the guilt she'd never voiced. I'm not proving, he said quietly. I'm fighting. For Wells's brother. For Epsilon, for us. The last word slipped out, unguarded, and Elena's breath caught. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling slightly. Us, she echoed, her voice barely audible. I thought I'd lost that chance. Their eyes locked, and amid Bay's hum faded into nothing. Lucius felt the pull of her, the unspoken promises they'd left behind. He leaned closer, his heart pounding, but the comm blared, shattering the moment. Captain Vasquez, report to command for briefing. Juarez's voice snapped. Elena's hand slipped from his, her expression torn between duty and longing. We're not done, she said, standing. Promise me you'll be careful. Careful's not my style, Lucius replied, a half-smile masking the ache in his chest. But I'll be here. She nodded, her eyes lingering on him before she turned and left. Lucius lay back, the cot cold against his skin. Thal's respect was a start, but the war wasn't one. Someone out there, human or otherwise, wanted this duel to fail. In Elena's words, her touch, were a reminder of what he stood to lose. He closed his eyes, steeling himself. One more round. One more chance to show the galaxy what a junkyard dog could do. The arena shimmered with an eerie glow, its walls pulsing with patterns of light that seemed almost alive. The third round's environment was a hybrid, a sprawling orbital platform suspended in a simulated starfield, its surface a maze of ancient machinery and crystalline conduits. Lucius Cooper sat in Bessie's cockpit, the neural interface helmet buzzing against his temples, its feedback sharper than before. The Mech's controls felt heavy, each movement dragging against the strain of 2 grueling rounds. Bessie's hull was a patchwork of fresh welds and scorched armor, her systems pushed to their limits. Through the viewport, Lucius saw the platform's jagged silhouette, its alien architecture both beautiful and foreboding. Pilot Cooper, this is Control, the comm crackled. Final round entry in 30 seconds. Stand by. Lucius exhaled, his breath fogging the cockpit's scratched interior. His shoulders still ached from a neural strain of the last match, but he pushed the pain aside. One more, old girl, he whispered to Bessie, patting the console. The Mech responded with a faint hum, as if acknowledging the stakes. A draw in round 2 had shaken the Tal Sherry, but this was the decider, for Earth, for Epsilon 4, for the recruits watching from Outpost 7. Across the arena, Bleeding Haven materialized, its silver-blue hull pristine despite the previous rounds. Thal's Mech moved with a predator's grace, its thrusters flaring as it took position atop a crystalline spire. Lucius felt the weight of that machine, its triple redundant systems and phase-shift armor a stark contrast to Bessie's cobbled-together frame. But Thal wasn't just a machine now. After 2 rounds, Lucius had seen the warrior behind the controls, a mind as sharp as his tech, but not infallible. Respect had grown between them, fragile but real. Combat protocols engaged, the arena AI announced. Round 3 commences in 3 to 1. The tones sounded, and Lucius sent Bessie lurching forward, her jets firing unevenly as she navigated the platform's uneven terrain. He aimed for a cluster of conduits, their faint glow suggesting power lines he could exploit. Thal, predictably, took the high ground, Bleeding Haven's cannons charging for a long-range strike. Lucius was ready to play the underdog again, weaving Bessie through the maze to bait Thal into overcommitting. But something was wrong. The arena's lights flickered, then surged, bathing the platform in a blinding white. A low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through Bessie's frame. Lucius's HUD flickered, error codes cascading across the screen. "Control, what's happening?" he demanded, but the comm was silent. Across the platform, Bleeding Haven froze, its sensors pivoting wildly. Thal's voice broke, through on an open channel. "Human, do you feel this?" Before Lucius could respond, the platform shuddered. Crystalline conduits flared, and from the arena's core, a massive structure rose. A monolithic construct of black metal and pulsing light, its surface etched with runes that seemed to writhe. Drones detached from its frame, their sleek forms armed with energy lances that crackled with lethal intent. A voice boomed, not through the comm, but in Lucius's mind, cold and ancient. "Intruders detected. Neutralization protocol initiated. Control, report." Lucius shouted, but static answered. The drones surged forward, their lances firing beams that scorched the platform. One grazed Bessie's arm, melting a patch of armor. Lucius yanked the controls, sending the mech behind a conduit for cover. Bleeding Haven dodged with uncanny precision, but even Cthal couldn't outrun the swarm. "This is no duel." Cthal's voice came again, strained. "What is this?" Lucius's mind raced. The Talsheri station was old, built on the ruins of a long-dead civilization. This wasn't arena tech. It was something older, an AI guardian mistaking them for threats. "Cthal, we're not fighting each other anymore," Lucius said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We take this thing down, or we're both dead." A pause, then Cthal's reply, clipped but resolute. "Agreed. Lead, human." The drones split their assault, half targeting Bessie, half bleeding Haven. Lucius darted from cover, firing plasma bursts to draw their attention. Bessie's targeting system struggled, but he aimed manually, years of sim failures guiding his hands. He hit one drone, its frame exploding in a shower of sparks, but more took its place. Bleeding Haven countered with surgical strikes, its lasers carving through the swarm, but the construct itself was the real threat. Its runes pulsed faster, and Lucius felt a pressure in his skull, the AI's presence probing his neural interface. From the observation gallery, Elena Vasquez watched in horror, her hands pressed against the console. The diplomats were in chaos, human and Talsheri alike shouting for answers. "It's not our tech," she snapped to Juarez, her eyes fixed on the arena feed. "It's the station, something ancient." She accessed the Talsheri archives, her diplomatic clearance granting partial access. Lines of alien script scrolled across her screen, fragments of a language older than both species. "It's a defense system," she whispered, piecing together the data. "It sees all of us as invaders." Elena opened a channel to Lucius, her voice cutting through the static. "Lucius, it's an AI, a remnant of the station's builders. It's powered by a central core in the construct. Destroy it, or it'll wipe out the entire station." Her words were calm, but Lucius heard the fear beneath them. "Got a plan?" he asked, dodging another lance. "Working on it," she replied. "I'm translating its protocols. It has a failsafe, but you'll need to get close." Lucius relayed the intel to Cthal, who was pinned behind a spire. "Close is suicide," Cthal said, his voice tight as Bleeding Haven's armor flickered under a barrage. "Your mech cannot withstand it." Lucius grinned, reckless and defiant. "Watch me." He sent Bessie charging toward the construct, using debris as shields. The drones swarmed, their lances tearing into Bessie's frame. Warning lights flooded the cockpit, but Lucius pushed forward, his focus razor-sharp. Cthal followed, Bleeding Haven's cannons clearing a path. "You are insane," Cthal muttered, but there was admiration in his tone. Lucius targeted the construct's core, a glowing nexus behind a lattice of black metal. Bessie's plasma cannon was too weak to breach it alone. "Cthal, I need your firepower," Lucius said. "Cover me, and I'll overload Bessie's core. It's our only shot." Cthal hesitated, then agreed. "Do it, human." Bleeding Haven moved into position, its phase shift armor forming a protective barrier. Lucius rerouted Bessie's power, bypassing every safety protocol. The cockpit grew hot, the neural interface searing his nerves. "Elena, you with me?" he called. Her voice came through, strained but clear. "The failsafe is a frequency pulse, 268.4 megahertz. Hit it when you're in range." Lucius nodded, though she couldn't see. "Hang dai." As Bessie closed in, the AI's voice roared in his mind, a cacophony of rage and static. Lucius gritted his teeth, his vision blurring. The drones focused their fire, but Cthal held the line, Bleeding Haven's shield glowing under the strain. "Now, human!" Cthal shouted. Lucius slammed the override, Bessie's core surging to critical. He fired the pulse at the core's frequency, then released the mech's energy in a catastrophic burst. The explosion rocked the arena, a blinding flare that consumed the construct's nexus. The drones froze, then fell, their lights fading. The AI's voice went silent, the pressure in Lucius's skull vanishing. Bessie collapsed, her systems fried, cockpit dark except for emergency lights. Bleeding Haven stood battered but intact, its shield scorched. Lucius unstrapped himself, gasping, the pain in his shoulder now a dull roar. He climbed out, the platform's air cold against his sweat-soaked skin. Thal approached, his scales dulled by dust and heat. "You succeeded," he said, his voice heavy with something like awe. Lucius leaned against Bessie's ruined frame, catching his breath. "We succeeded," he corrected, offering a tired grin. Thal extended a clawed hand, a gesture Lucius recognized as a warrior's respect. He took it, their grip firm despite the divide between species. "You are no junkyard dog," Thal said. "You are a storm." From the control room, Elena's voice broke through, trembling with relief. "Lucius, you're alive." He managed a weak chuckle. "Barely. Tell Juarez we're going to need a new mech." The gallery was silent, the diplomats too stunned to react. The duel was over, not with a victor, but with a shared survival. Lucius looked at Thal, then at Bessie's wreckage. They'd stopped the catastrophe, but the cost was steep, and somewhere, the saboteur who'd started this mess was still out there. The training bay of Outpost 7 was quieter now, the hum of simulators replaced by the soft clatter of tools and the occasional laugh from the recruits. A month had passed since the chaos of the Talsheri station, but the air still carried a spark of change. Lucius Cooper stood at the observation window, watching his class run through a new scenario, one he'd designed himself, inspired by the asteroid field and the AI's relentless drones. The holographic display glowed steady, no longer flickering, thanks to a rare budget boost from Earth Command. Outpost 7 was no longer a forgotten backwater. It was a proving ground, and Lucius was its heart. He leaned against the control panel, its surface smoother now, patched with care like Bessie had been. The old mech was gone, its wreckage deemed unsalvageable after the final round. Lucius didn't mourn her. She'd gone out a hero, her core's sacrifice etched into the station's logs and the minds of those who'd watched. In her place, a new training mech stood in the bay, sleeker, but still bearing the scars of Outpost 7's gritty spirit. Lucius had named it Phoenix, a nod to rising from ashes. It felt right. The recruits moved with purpose, their sim scores climbing under Lucius's relentless drills. Wells, no longer the lanky kid who'd groaned about long hours, led his squad with a confidence that made Lucius proud. "Use the debris, Wells," Lucius called through the comm. "It's not just cover, it's a weapon." Wells nodded, his mech pivoting to sling a virtual asteroid at an enemy target. The move wasn't perfect, but it was bold, and Lucius allowed a rare smile. These kids were learning to think, not just fight. They'd be ready for whatever came next. The bay doors hissed open, and Commander Juarez stepped in, her uniform as crisp as ever. Lucius straightened, expecting another briefing, but her expression was softer than usual. "Sergeant Cooper," she said, handing him a tablet. "Earth Command's offering you a promotion. Full reinstatement, pilot status, a posting on the Epsilon front." Lucius scanned the document, the words blurring as memories of the Academy flashed through his mind. A second chance, the kind he'd stopped dreaming about years ago. He handed the tablet back. "Appreciate it, Commander, but I'm good here. These kids need someone who's been through the ringer, not another hotshot chasing medals." Juarez raised an eyebrow, but there was approval in her gaze. "You're sure?" she asked. Lucius nodded, glancing at the recruits. "Outpost 7's where I make a difference. Besides, I'm not big on desk jobs." Juarez left with a nod, and Lucius turned back to the sim, but a new figure caught his eye. Elena Vasquez stood at the bay's edge, her EDF uniform traded for a lighter jacket, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked different, less like the officer who'd briefed him under pressure, more like the Elena he'd known in the academy, before the world pulled them apart. His pulse quickened, and he crossed the room to meet her. "You didn't take the promotion," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and something warmer. Lucius shrugged, leaning against a workbench. "Not my style." You know that. Elena's lips curved into a smile, and she stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint lines of worry etched around her eyes. I do, she said softly, but I thought you'd at least consider it. After everything, Lucius looked at her, really looked, and saw the weight of their shared history. The sim that had cost him his career, the years of silence, the moments in the arena where her voice had been his anchor. I considered it, he admitted, but this is where I belong. Teaching, building something that lasts. What about you? Still chasing diplomatic wins? Elena laughed, a sound that eased the ache in his chest. For now, but I'm here, aren't I? Her words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Lucius reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers, and this time, there was no calm to interrupt. Elena, he said, his voice low, back there, in the med bay, you said we weren't done. Were you serious? Her eyes met his, unguarded, and she nodded. I am. But we've got responsibilities, Lucius. You've got your recruits, I've got trade talks. Can we make this work? He squeezed her hand, the warmth of her skin grounding him. We've faced worse odds. I'm not running from this. Elena's smile widened, but there was a bittersweet edge to it. Then we take it slow, she said. No rusing, no regrets. Lucius nodded, the promise settling like a quiet fire in his chest. They stood there, hands linked, until Wells's voice broke the moment. Sarge, Sim's done. You coming? Elena stepped back, her fingers slipping from his. Go, she said, her voice warm. Your kids need you. Lucius watched her go, the door sliding shut behind her, but the ache was softer now, laced with hope. They weren't done, just beginning. Later that day, a package arrived, delivered by a Talsheri courier. Inside was a shard of silver-blue metal, its surface etched with faint runes. A note accompanied it, written in K'Thal's precise script, from Bleeding Haven to Honor Storm. Failure teaches, survival binds. We will meet again. Lucius turned the shard over in his hands, its weight a reminder of the duel, the AI, the moment he and K'Thal had stood together against annihilation. He placed it on his desk, next to a photo of his recruits, a quiet testament to what they'd built. The galaxy was changing. Trade talks had shifted, the Epsilon Belt now a shared resource under new agreements. A joint training program was in the works, with Outpost 7 as its hub and Lucius and K'Thal as its unlikely ambassadors. The saboteur remained a shadow, their identity still elusive, but Lucius knew the truth would surface in time. For now, he had work to do. He returned to the sim room, the recruits waiting, their eyes bright with questions. All right, Lucius said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Let's talk about fighting when the rules break. Because that's when you find out who you are. As the display flared to life, Lucius felt the shard's weight in his pocket, Elena's promise in his heart, and the galaxy's possibilities stretching out before him. Outpost 7 wasn't much, but it was his, and that was enough.